What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So I want to go ahead and continue with this series of the top 10 NBA drafts, at least in my opinion, that we've ever seen. And I believe I'm at number 4 right now. Number 4 on the countdown. So just to do a brief recap. At number 10, I had the 1998 draft. At number 9, the 1999 draft. At number 8, the 2009 draft. At number 7, the 1987 draft. At number 6, the 1970 draft. And at number 5, I had the 1985 draft. So at number 4, I have the 1981 draft, which I think is probably the most underrated draft in NBA history. I think it is because there are certain drafts that pop up in people's minds, like 3 really, when you think of the greatest drafts, right? One in the 2000s, one in the 90s, one in the 80s. We know what they are. I'm not going to say them right now. But there's another one in the 80s that people don't talk about. It's the 81 draft. And I think the best prospect out of that draft was probably, as far as their career went, was probably Isaiah Thomas. But there were some other great players that came out of that draft. Other great players. And Isaiah was not the first overall pick in that draft. But the 1981 NBA draft was held on June 9th, 1981, between the 80, 81, and 81, 82 seasons. And 23 NBA teams took turns selecting amateur U.S. college basketball players and other eligible players, including international players, in this particular draft. And this is back with when the draft was determined by a coin flip. And these are the players selected in that particular draft. First overall was Mark Aguirre out of DePaul. He was drafted by the Dallas Mavericks. Of course, Mark Aguirre would be a solid scorer with the Dallas Mavericks. Then again, I think he's probably known too for winning a championship with, actually 2 championships, with the Detroit Pistons in the late 1980s when he was traded from Dallas to Detroit for Adrian Dantley at the behest of his good buddy Isaiah Thomas. Speaking of Isaiah Thomas, number 2 in that draft was Isaiah Thomas out of Indiana, of course drafted to the Detroit Pistons. Isaiah Thomas, of course, would have a Hall of Fame career, would rack up, I believe it was, over 9,000 assists, and I believe he scored something around, thinking off the top of my head, 19,000 points, I believe it was. But anyway, Isaiah Thomas, a candidate for one of the greatest little men the game has ever seen. Number 3 in that draft was Buck Williams out of Maryland. He was drafted by the New Jersey Nets. Buck Williams went on to have a long career in the NBA, with stints with the Bucks and Portland. He played also with the Knicks. But he probably is one of the most accomplished Nets players, perhaps the most accomplished Nets player the game has seen. And I believe he was Rookie of the Year. Was he Rookie of the Year in 81, 82? I think he was. Let me check that out right quick. Yeah. He was. He was Rookie of the Year, 1981-82. Number 4 was Al Wood out of North Carolina. And Al Hood was selected by the Atlanta Hawks. He did not have the career that people were expecting of him. Played into the 1990s. But as of 1987, he was out the NBA, but played overseas until the early 1990s. Number 5 was Danny Vrains, I believe his name is. And he was another guy who, power forward, didn't really make it. You know, he was a bust. Out of Utah, and I think Danny Vrains played for the Sonics, the Sixers, selected by the Sonics, played for the Sixers, but by 1988, he was out of the NBA. Number 6, the late Orlando Woolridge, out of Notre Dame, selected by the Chicago Bulls. Now, of course, we know Orlando Woolridge for being, for a couple of years, a teammate of a young Michael Jordan. Orlando Woolridge also played for teams, other teams like the, I remember having stints for the Pistons, the Nuggets, the Lakers. Let's see. Orlando Woolridge was best when he was playing with teams that had more of a fast pace, up and down, you know, instead of half-court type offense. He was better with a more full-court, fast-paced team. But he played with the Bulls, the Nets, the Lakers, the Nuggets, the Pistons, the Bucks, the Sixers, and then a couple of years overseas. At his best, he was a 23 to 25 point per game type guy. Passed away about 10 years ago. So next in the draft was Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson wasn't a big star, out of Oregon State. Played with the Kansas City Omaha Kings, who would soon become the Sacramento Kings. He had a solid career, but was not a star in the NBA. The guy who was a star was the 8th overall pick, Tom Chambers out of Utah, selected by the San Diego Clippers. Tom Chambers' best years came with the Sonics and then later on the Phoenix Suns. Tom Chambers, for a couple of years, a big-time scorer in the NBA, and was the 1987 All-Star Game MVP. Tom Chambers is the first man to score 20,000 career points and not be in the Hall of Fame. Now he's been joined by that feat by a couple other guys. Antawn Jamison, I know Antawn Jamison scored 20,000 points and isn't in the Hall of Fame. Joe Johnson, I don't think is eligible yet, but I don't know if he'll be voted to the Hall of Fame either. But anyway, number 9, Rolando Blackman out of Kansas State. Played with the Dallas Mavericks. And Rolando Blackman, one of the big scorers of the 1980s, on those great Dallas Mavericks teams that had him and you had briefly there Dale Ellis. You also had Mark Aguirre, who was in this draft, and you also Derek Harper. Those are some really good teams. Never were able to get over the hump as far as beating like teams like the Showtime Lakers, but then, of course, at 10th, you had Albert King, who was the younger brother of superstar Bernard King out of Maryland, selected by the Nets, and he never had the career that people expected him to have, but it is what it is. Next, of course, you have Frank Johnson out of Wake Forest, selected by the then Washington Bullets. Frank Johnson, I remember him as a kid, more or less, for his brief stint with the Phoenix Suns coming off the bench. when Charles Barkley was there. I think between like 92, 93, and 93, 94, somewhere in that range. But Frank Johnson had an unspectacular career. At number 12, you have Kelly Tripucka. All right, Kelly Tripucka out of Notre Dame. Kelly Tripucka was a big-time scorer for several years in the NBA, especially with the Detroit Pistons. He teamed up with Isaiah Thomas to have several big scoring years. He didn't look the part of a basketball player, you know what I'm saying? But he could ball. He could ball. He could score. Next, you have Danny Shays, who was the son of NBA legend Dolph Shays. And Danny Shays played, I think, something like 18 seasons in the NBA. Solid player, not big, not great, but solid. Drafted by the Utah Jazz, then played for the Nuggets, the Bucks, the Lakers, the Suns, the Heat, and finished his career in 1999 with the Orlando Magic. So Danny Shays played all the way until he was about 40 years of age. Now, next, of course, you have Herb Williams out of Ohio State. Herb Williams, for many years, played with the Indiana Pacers. And also played for the Dallas Mavericks and had a stint with the Knicks in the 90s, back when those teams with Pat Ewing and Oakley, Starks. He came off the bench for those teams. Finished his NBA career after a brief stop over with the Raptors, came back to the Knicks and finished his career in 1999. He was a center coming into the league. Next is Jeff Lamp. The only thing I know about Jeff Lamp is that he was the starting point guard for the Lakers in the '89 finals when Magic went down. And that's one of the main reasons why the Lakers got swept in that finals. Next, you have Darnell Valentine, Kevin Lotter, Ray Tolbert, Mike McGee. I don't know any of these guys really, not going to lie to you. But then you have Larry Nance, the 20th pick out of Clemson, drafted by the Phoenix Suns. Larry Nance was spectacular with the Phoenix Suns. I remember him, Larry Nance, being a shot blocker, a good defensive player, shot blocker, decent rebounder, great scorer. Also had great years with the Cleveland Cavaliers. He was a three-time All-Star. In 1989, NBA All-Defensive First Team, twice in the early 90s, All-Defensive Second Team, won the Slam Dunk Contest Championship against Julius Erving in 1984, and his number 22 is retired by the Cleveland Cavaliers. Of course, he is the father, if I'm not mistaken. Is he the father of Grant? Yeah, the father. Yeah, he's the father of Larry Nance Jr. Then, of course, next you have Alton Lister, a solid big man in the NBA for many years. Not great, but solid, out of Arizona State. Trying to recognize anybody else in this draft. Then you have Eddie Johnson. Eddie Johnson was a big-time scorer in the NBA for many years. He was the sixth man of the year in 1989. Greek League champion in 1995. Greek League Finals MVP in 1996. No, 1995, excuse me. And was a Greek All-Star in 1994. But in the NBA, he played for the Kings, the Suns, the Sonics, the Hornets. After 1 year playing overseas, came back to the NBA in 1995, played with the Pacers, and finished his career with the Houston Rockets. You may remember him having one of the big shots in Rockets history in a playoff game against the Utah Jazz. The same series that John Stockton hit the game winner. I think 2 games before that, Eddie Johnson hit a game winner. I think it was a long 3 or something. But anyway, Eddie Johnson scored over 19,000 career points and averaged 16 points a game. He can light up with the best of them. At number 31, you have Danny Ainge out of Brigham Young. Of course, Danny Ainge is synonymous with the Boston Celtics, winning, I believe it was 2 NBA championships with the Celtics. But then, of course, later on, after the 87-88 season, when Danny Ainge would set a record at the time for most three-point field goals in the season with 148, he was then traded to the Sacramento Kings, where he played there for a couple of years, and then Danny Ainge, as a reserve later on in his career, played with the Portland Trailblazers and finished his career with the Phoenix Suns in the mid-1990s. Danny Ainge, of course, had a career as an executive later on, and was the, I can't remember his title, was general manager or president of basketball operations, but as the head honcho, I think he was general manager. But as the head honcho of the Boston Celtics, as far as running the team, he was the one responsible for getting the Big Three together that won their last title back 15-some years ago. Danny Ainge was an all-star in 87-88, the year that I told you that he set what was then the record for most three-pointers in a season. Little people, I don't think a lot of people know this, but Danny Ainge was a great athlete. And Danny Ainge also had a brief career in baseball for the Toronto Blue Jays back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I'm looking at the rest of this draft, and Frank Bukowski was part of this draft, and that's about it. That's about it. But that's a lot of great players, man. That's a lot of great players that were a part of this draft, man. And anyway, a lot of great players that made up the 1980s and 1990s. Anyway, tell me what you guys think.